to this podcast from the Human Capital Institute's webcast on onboarding and reboarding virtual talent. This webcast was brought to you by Taleo. The days of traditional orientation in a room with other new hires is a fading practice, especially when most of your talent is virtual or when talent returns from leave or retirement. Onboarding must be virtual, engaging, and able to connect people to critical information and resources they need. Listen to Chad Thompson, Ph.D. and Senior Consultant at Aon Consulting, and Pat Caputo, Ph.D. and also Senior Consultant at Aon Consultant. They'll teach us how to prepare your organization to embrace the opportunities of onboarding virtual talent and how to successfully tackle inherent challenges.
So when we talk about this theme of onboarding, we really want to talk about it through the lens of onboarding as a transition, and that's a theme that we'll come back to later in this presentation. Another key question to ask is, who are virtual workers? And this answer is becoming increasingly gray and further from being just black and white. Two types of jobs that Chad and I are very familiar with are educators or professors, as well, of course, as being consultants. There's a line that is constantly blurred. What really constitutes virtual worker and a traditional worker in today's ever-changing work environment. Of course, there are times when we have to be in person, in front of a class or in front of a client. But often, even people who are not traditionally considering themselves virtual workers do work at home, do work on the road, or do work while searching for that elusive outlet at the airport. So really the definition of who are virtual workers, more and more, we're finding in that umbrella to be increasing. Additionally, people differ. So some people tend to be what we call blenders, people who tend to blend work and non-work life. Those are people who might check their BlackBerries just before going to bed at night and first thing when they wake up in the morning, while other people draw far firmer distinctions between work and non-work life. So the implication here is that the definition of virtual workers is really a continuum, and there's no one solution to onboarding or managing virtual workers.
What we find is that companies are really using virtual work as a way to retain key talent through some life transitions. So, for example, someone's spouse gets transferred across the country. If you don't have a virtual work program, maybe that person, you lose them. You don't get to retain them and all their expertise in your organization. It's also a really important attractor for Gen Y talent. And Pat talked a little bit before about work-life meshing. And I really think it's more work-life meshing than it is balance, right? What we're finding is that Gen Y talent really kind of desires to have the ability to work at 10 o'clock at night if they want to, and just have a little more flexibility in terms of how they structure their day and really mesh work and life together. We did a benefits and talent survey at Aon where we talked to several hundred HR executives. Maybe some of you participated, if so, thank you. But one of the most striking outcomes of that research was that 97% of the people that we talked to, and that seems like a ridiculously high number, but 97% of the people we talked to said their virtual work programs, if they have one, were either going to stay the same or increase. So it's clear to us that this is not a trend, it's not a fad that's going to at some point go away. The benefits are just too obvious and too clear to ignore. So Pat mentioned risk, which is kind of a weird way to think about this topic, but I think it's really striking in that it's not a free lunch. So all of those great benefits that we saw, those all come in the context of, okay, that's true, but you have to do it the right way. You'll get the real estate savings, but are your folks going to remain engaged? Are they going to remain productive? Are they going to remain plugged into their coworkers? All of those sort of things. So there are some things to worry about and some questions to ask yourselves as you start to put people into virtual work settings and by extension onboard them into such. So are they being integrated into the culture? This is especially true for people who are new to the organization. So have they been integrated? Have they been socialized? And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Have I facilitated knowledge exchange between them and their colleagues, especially in positions where there are some interdependencies and some interconnectedness in terms of the tasks that you're asking them to accomplish? Do they know how to work the technology? You're probably going to have potentially some social media sort of things. We'll talk about that. You might have some real-time collaboration sites. Do they just kind of know what they're doing, and can they do their job in the context of some different technology than what they may be used to? This model that you see here is an example of an onboarding program that we've used successfully with some of our clients. And as I mentioned, we'll really use this as a way to structure our discussion today. We want to focus on how each of these areas really plays out in onboarding in the virtual context. The other thing we want to demonstrate is that you probably don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's good news, of course. But we'll start with selection, an area that's really near and dear to Pat and I as industrial and organizational psychologists. From a selection standpoint, we really tend to go back to selection as really the first aspect of all good onboarding programs. And from the selection standpoint, what that means is really two things. One, understanding what the job is. So what are you asking them to do? What are the tasks you're asking them to accomplish? How are you asking them to do that from a behavioral standpoint? And two, and kind of by extension, what skills are required to do that job effectively? We've done a lot of research into this area, and we've really determined there are really kind of a set of preferences and skills and attributes that are related to success working in a virtual environment. For example, a preference for structuring your own work is really critical, given kind of the increased autonomy in a virtual setting, and we're excluding, of course, situations where perhaps it's a call center and calls are just coming into you. That would be an exception to this, of course. So one of the key things that we want to think about once someone's actually in the door, as Pat said, is the extent to which they're socialized and integrated into the organization. And it's really a critical aspect with any onboarding program, but especially so in a virtual environment. And by socialization and integration, we mean things like learning the stories of the organization, learning how that one deal got closed, learning how that one product got developed. As Pat mentioned, knowing who's who and learning the culture, and how to navigate the inherent social politics that happen in organizations. Really, 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 really tough to do with static content, even if it's enabled technology. One of the key things about organizational socialization that the research suggests is how do you identify with the organization, right? That's really key for retention, reducing turnover, and just kind of feeling like you're part of something. If I'm in the loop and I go to work for Aon, I literally walk into the Aon Center every day with all the associated signage and corporate branding and all that stuff. When I walk from my bedroom downstairs to my office, you just don't have that. So how do you get people integrated and socialized into the organization when they're not exposed to all of those informal sort of things that Pat talked about? So you want to evaluate everything you do and everything that's really touched by virtual work against the plan. And I say the plan because that infers that there have been some goals set on the front end. So that word's used very purposefully. So you want to you really want to be looking, and this is an example of kind of three different ways you can bucket this analysis. But you really want to look at the usefulness of the virtual tools and the virtual onboarding program that you've set up. You want to look at the productivity of the employee, just kind of the what of what they're doing. And you also want to look at some of the social, some of the integration, some of the relationship building sort of things that are important as well.
Thanks, Chad. I just want to end this presentation by really just introducing a relatively new topic, and that's reboarding virtual workers. As we talked about previously, virtual workers are shifting. The trends and how work is being done is constantly changing. And what we find is that people are taking advantage of virtual work arrangements to reduce work and family conflicts, and often transitioning from traditional to virtual work arrangements for extended periods of time, and then coming back to the office once those obligations have been either resolved or lessened. And what I want to stress here is the importance of consistency. Now, we talked about onboarding as a transition, and this is simply another transition for an employee. It's really just either a mini onboarding or a series of reboarding efforts. And during this transition, like we spoke about previously, there is some anxiety. And here, one thing that we haven't talked about is the importance of an established and well-communicated virtual work policy.